This is an interview with Thomas Youngren, Professor Emeritus of English with Elgin Community College. He lives in Huntley, Illinois, currently. Tom was employed with Elgin Community College from 1971 to 2002 and made significant contributions to the college within the areas of curriculum development, instructional technology as a tool in the classroom, in professional development, evaluation, and research, and the college's accreditation efforts. This interview is being conducted on February 12, 2016 at Elgin Community College. The interviewer is Polly Nash, and the interview is being recorded by Jack Weiss. Thank you for your contributions to ECC and for talking with us today. May we start out with a little bit about your history?
Sure. I want to thank you as well and for giving me such a strong motivation to reread your book. It was very helpful in sorting out some names and faces and dates. My beginnings were in Galesburg, Illinois, and west central Illinois. And Galesburg at that time was a self-contained community with pretty strong economy, at least for our times.
And
it was 1943, so we were not quite baby boomers. The cohort I went through school with would have been just before the baby boom, and our parents had lived through the Depression and World War II and had been strongly marked by those things, and they were trying to normalize their lives at that point. So it really, growing up in that place, which was still safe, at least it was perceived to be safe, was great. We weren't very well off, but everybody was pretty much in the same boat. My parents, my dad had come through the war. He'd been very successful there, and then ran into some business problems in a recession in the 50s. So though he was college educated, he took a job as a laborer and was among those who lost a pension to the Teamsters at a point in the 1950s and had to change careers. But he did that and worked very hard, stressing education all the time so that my brothers and I could go to school.
And how many brothers did you have?
I have two. They are Doug and Steve. I'll say a little more about that in a second or two. The other person I really want to mention is my mother, who was raising us and raising us as culturally richly as she could under the circumstances, and a full-time mother until my youngest brother, Steve, entered school, and then she went to grade school teaching. She was a first grade teacher for many, many years in the Galesburg school system. We, as I said, were not particularly well off, but it was a great community. We had a very strong economy based on rails. Galesburg was a major rail center at the time. Some manufacturing and agriculture. From that base, we started school and progressed through what seemed to be, for the time anyway, a very strong school system. And the thing that hit us most strongly, I think, was Sputnik and the revelations about how America wasn't competitive in math, science, and in education generally. And the school district was very rich. We had a strong faculty in a variety of areas, from vocational to liberal arts. It was a very good faculty. I think part of the factor behind that was that we had a good liberal arts college in town, and the expectations were very high. And those folks made sure on the school board that education was valued. So I had a cohort in school that was really very, very strong. we were also a power in basketball. Basketball was king. I later learned that Paul Heath remembered us from his times in Quincy because the Galesburg civic leaders stole the best basketball players from Quincy after the year they got to the state finals. And we were actually responsible, because of this raid on a neighboring community, for the 18-year-old rule, because the ineligibility for kids over 18 was to get even for the fact that Bumpy Nixon, our big star, had been taken away from Quincy. Anyhow, it was a diverse school district, and I think this was very important in my background. My parents were not prejudiced. They were, in fact, quite liberal for the community they were in, and there was a strong element of Hispanic and black kids and middle-class families who were upwardly mobile after the war, as were the rest of us. So the school was heavily integrated and had, besides an all-star basketball team, an all-star debate team, and I couldn't crack the varsity in either one. But it was an environment that really valued achievement, working hard, trying to get ahead. So it was a natural. One reason we ended up with, as I said, not a lot of money. There were no community colleges at the time. So in Galesburg, it was a wonderful asset, and a large part of my high school class, at least of the higher scoring kids and the better athletes, ended up going to Knox College as a commuter school. It is, as I said, a strong liberal arts college. There were very challenging students from other places. So out of that high school class, a number of us, quite a few, over 30, went to Knox. Others who were high achievers on a national merit scholarships and so forth went to Ivy League schools or University of Chicago or other liberal arts colleges that were away from home. My original plan was really just to go 2 years at Knox, save money, and then try to go somewhere else. But my parents did not support the idea of borrowing to send kids to college. So they worked very hard and they saved. Obviously, I and my brothers worked, like almost all of the kids in our community who were upwardly mobile. We were encouraged to leave. And this was the time in the late 50s, early 60s, when the suburbs were just developing around Chicago and around other metropolitan areas. There was a real movement away from agriculture and the small towns toward population centers. So that's the way the dispersion pretty much took place in our little town.
So you went to Knox College for the 4 years.
I ended up staying because I really began to take hold and had strong academic achievement by the middle of my sophomore year, and at that point began to target graduate school. So I'd finished German for 2 years, consciously started taking French. The big decision was deciding what to major in, because I was very strongly interested in both political science and English.
And what helped you to make that decision?
I think part of it was my mentors there. Another part of it was that political science was changing. It was a period in time in the early 1960s when there was a shift from an emphasis on international relations and practical politics, campaigns, legislation, to behaviorism. And I wasn't really that strongly interested in spending a lot of time on statistics. Ironically, I ended up having to do that later.
So you went on, you finished Knox,
Mm-hmm.
and you then,
Again, National Defense Education Act provided me with a fellowship to Brown University. So after marrying the girl I'd been dating since sophomore year, which also was a turning point in my life at that point, we got married in August after graduation, loaded a U-Haul trailer, and left for Providence, Rhode Island. She had no job, but had been interviewed by the Providence school system. They had a superintendent in Peoria, Illinois, which was nearby, interview her because she had applied long distance, and they said, come on down when you get to Rhode Island. So that was the start of our odyssey.
and how did you choose Brown?
My choices were University of Wisconsin, at least my primary ones I thought I could afford, where when we went up to visit, we couldn't find anybody at all in the English department, and went into the graduate school of English, and there were two doors. One was graduate students A through L, and the other one was for M through Z. So I weighed that against the guy 3 doors down who had helped get me interested in and admitted to Brown, one of my English professors, and that was a very easy choice, especially since I had a full ride.
Right. And so you traveled halfway across the country to Brown, and how did you find Providence in terms of that time? What year was that?
Well, that would have been 1965. We got there, got settled, and she indeed did find a job in teaching in a college preparatory high school, which was very prestigious for that particular community, except that the mafia milked all the money out of the community and of the schools. It was a very corrupt area. Providence was the capital of the mafia in Rhode Island. So Classical High School was actually a derelict building. Their central staircase had burned out maybe 30 years ago. There'd been a bond issue several times to try to build new schools, including a new Classical High School, and never happened. The money never got delivered to the need. So during that time, we got settled, but she decided fairly early on she didn't want to stay with teaching, at least not in that school system. So she got a job at Butler Hospital teaching students. It was a mental facility, a private mental hospital, and a very prestigious one. So she was teaching students who were confined there and working with their home schools, the ones they'd come from, on curriculum and developing curriculum for that school. So we had a great time. We certainly enjoyed New England. It broadened our horizons. Her parents, my brothers visited, and we would have loved to have stayed in New England, but events intervened and we did not.
And those events?
Well, a combination of things. One would be the Vietnam War, which was important. The other one was that I made the decision that I really did not want to stay in graduate school at that point. I wanted to finish and move out.
So you finished with
A master's, and I had almost all the coursework for a doctorate. So this was at 2.5 years. So I definitely wanted out. I definitely wanted to test reality. I wanted to test because I'd only been a student all those years, whether I really wanted to teach. At this point, I'd like to pick up on my brothers, if I could.
Sure, absolutely.
If you don't
Absolutely.
mind.
Doug and Steve.
Doug and Steve, and the sociological situation at the time. Doug, like me, the community college had not really gotten rolling, and it was natural. He, like other kids in our situation, went to Knox. My brother Steve did not end up going to Knox. He wanted to get away, and he wanted a bigger campus. So Doug ended up finishing at Knox, going to Tulane, and then to Air Force ROTC. Steve came ultimately to Northern Illinois University, because that's the next part of the story. When we returned to Illinois, I was teaching for 3 years at NIU in the English department.
So you finished your degree at Brown and then applied at Northern for...
Yes.
Okay.
There were two things in the interim. I applied for Naval ROTC, and I took a job at Worcester Junior College. I had hoped to be able to stay in New England. At least we thought that would be a good idea. We liked it. The problem with the attempt to enlist was that I failed the physical, and I was rejected. And the other intervening incident was that my wife became pregnant. So with Linda pregnant and wanting to get closer to home, I looked for jobs in Illinois instead of staying in New England.
So you were at Worcester for a while?
About
then?
6 months.
6 months, okay. And
A full semester in summer school. And then NIU in the fall of 1969.
Got it. And what were you teaching at NIU?
At NIU, they had just gone through, or were in the process of building their enrollment on a massive scale. So they hired lots of instructors on 5-year contracts that would not end in tenure. And I was hired as one of those to teach freshman English and whatever else they found to assign us, and to hopefully, from their perspective, finish a doctorate at NIU. It was one of my first introductions to the cynicism of higher education, if you will. It was a reality check. But we went in the year of 1969 and 70 from being imposed on with a grading on a curve to eliminate large numbers of students to suddenly being told you're not allowed to eliminate students. And the causative factor was they finished the tower dormitories, the high-rise dormitories, and they wanted to fill them. So that was the level of academic decision-making in the state of Illinois in 1969 and 70, and sometimes things are still that quixotic.
Now, this wasn't the time, though, that Steve was at NIU?
Yes. He was ready for college by the point we got back there. And the thing he and my parents could agree on most easily was to send him to NIU. I tried not to get in his way as much as they probably hoped I would. But he did very well and went through his own growth pangs like we did when we were in Rhode Island. So it worked out very well for him. And the next phase of the story was that both my brothers and Linda's brother, like almost everybody else we knew, either ended up in the Chicago suburbs or somewhere else. Steve ended up coming to Elgin, unbeknownst to me, he met at a church that I didn't attend, a Lutheran church here, the girl who would be his wife, and about the first time she knew it for quite a while, but he introduced her to me. She had been in my class at ECC. She had completed 2 years at ECC and then gone to NIU and graduated there, and they met after graduation here. Needless to say, he never left town. And he worked many years and was not particularly involved in the community other than with his church, but between him and his wife Peg, they were pretty much responsible for the effort to build the Pioneer statue in downtown Elgin. His first apartment, which we helped him find because we used the IEA file at the IEA office to find rentals, something Gil Renner told me to do, to go down there when we moved here. 3 years later, when he moved, we went through the file, and the place he liked was an attic apartment in Trygve Rolstad's house. So he was connected with that family ever since.
So let's go back to 1971. How did you decide to come and apply at Elgin? Can you walk us through that?
Yeah, if we have time, I'll tell you a little bit about what I was doing while teaching at NIU,
Sure.
because it bears on some things that happened later. I really did enjoy the teaching very much, and had a mentor who was the director of freshman English, Jim Millard there, who's very well known on the NIU campus. And he ran a basketball game, basically, for recreation, and had all the instructors who could play decently join him. He had been a very strong college athlete at Lamar Tech, so he had us join him along with people from the athletic department. And besides that activity, he became a mentor and lined up a number of opportunities for me. Committee work on campus that most of the other instructors weren't doing. I was given the opportunity to teach on extension for a couple of years at the Illinois State Penitentiary Pontiac branch. So I was teaching at Pontiac, driving down 1 day a week. They got most of their courses from TV College out of Chicago, the Chicago City College system. But for their writing courses, their composition courses, and a few other courses, they really wanted live classroom teachers, and somehow NIU had the connection. So that was a very interesting experience. And the other factor that was involved, like I said, I was in a lot of committee work, and I was actually lined up to take the position as assistant director of freshman English that the previous assistant to Dr. Millard had complete everything but his dissertation. So he was ready to move on. And the causative factor really was that guy had a terrible time finding a job. This was the period when the graduate market, the market for new PhDs or near PhDs was really drying up in all the universities. And though I had that opportunity, I also knew that the community colleges were gearing up. And I knew that I really loved teaching freshman and sophomore courses, and I hated doing advanced graduate work and really the prospect of teaching upper division courses, because most of the senior professors I knew both at Brown and at, certainly not at Knox, but both at Brown and NIU were pretty screwed up in their personal lives. Not all, by all means, but I wasn't sure that's a lifestyle I wanted. So the openings were mainly in the Chicago metropolitan area in 1971 and in Minnesota, particularly in northern Minnesota. And my wife flat out said she was not going to northern Minnesota. So I answered a call for an interview at ECC. This was the first interview I got. I think I ultimately got a couple of others, but I was hired at ECC before I got to visit those other campuses. And that's how I got here.
Do you recall the interview and what happened when you came for that interview?
Oh, sure. It was on the core of this campus in the one building that had been completed along with a north annex that was being leased, I believe, at the time. So it was late May or early June. I know school was out here because they had a hard time rounding up a committee, or maybe they didn't want much of a committee. That's a little unclear. But drove over. There was no grass. The sidewalks were just in. So I parked at the bottom of the hill and walked up the sidewalk with dirt on all sides into a brand spanking new building, and was interviewed. I was welcomed by Charles Medeiros and Dean Chipman, and was interviewed first by them. And then I did get to see a small committee of English department members over in their office area. So I went through that interview. I had been told, I think mainly by Mr. Medeiros, that there was a little conflict in the department and that there were some differences of opinion about teaching. So I went into that interview and was indeed asked. I'm certain Walt Garrett was there, Irma Davis, and maybe a couple of other people. Ray Eberhardt wasn't available. He was apparently up at his place in Rhinelander, Wisconsin. So went through the questioning process, and a lot of it focused on my approach to teaching freshman English. And I was coming out of a university environment with 120 teachers where everybody did their own thing. So I described what I did, which was pretty traditional, but maybe with a few leanings toward more what became whole English, a more fluid approach than classical rhetoric. And somehow both sides of this group either thought they could mold me to their expectations or at least didn't find me totally objectionable. So they concurred. I know that, because Charles Medeiros told me, that he didn't have a choice. There were two positions open, and he had no choice on hiring one, but he wanted to hire the other one, and he wanted me. He said there had been board interference in the other position. So I was just happy. I mean, I liked the people. I didn't see that big a problem. Of course, not everybody was there. I liked the campus. I liked the idea. I was really excited about coming to this place. And a major factor was that Elgin at that point was not so much a commuter town. It was a lot like what we left behind in Galesburg that was starting to join the Rust Belt. it was coming on strong, but it was its own distinct community. It had its own manufacturing. There were commuters, but there were neighborhoods. And what looked like a vibrant community that was recovering from a difficult time losing its major employer. So,
And that major employer was?
the watch factory. I heard legends of the watch factory for several years. It actually was rubble by the time we got here. So we were part of that first major hiring for the new campus, and it was a very exciting time. I got off to a slow start because my father-in-law was dying and lingering in death as the semester started for the new year. I did get here, but my wife and baby were staying at home with her mother and visiting the hospital on a regular basis. We later learned that it essentially was what we've come to call Legionnaire's disease. He'd gone to a banking convention in Philadelphia and had a lingering illness that turned into pneumonia on a vacation in Wisconsin on a lake just before we moved to Elgin. In fact, we got the word he was in the hospital the day we moved into our apartment in Elgin. So I was commuting back and forth on the weekends for a while, and the semester started. In the interim, I did get a chance to speak with Ray Eberhardt, learned where my office would be, I learned what books I would be using, and waited to meet my colleagues.
So Ray was the department chair at that time?
Ray was the longtime department chair. It was an interesting mix for the campus. It was the first time the previous faculty, the faculty which had split off from the high school district in Elgin, had been brought together in one location. And besides that, there was quite a class of new people coming in. There were 2 people in English. Jack came in. There were probably 10 or 12 new faculty at that time. So I was getting to know the English department. At the same time, this campus was fresh, even for the people who'd been teaching here before. So it was kind of a new mix for everybody. I'm sure they had to adjust to us and become familiar with us, but they were becoming familiar with each other too.
You mentioned previously about a described conflict in the department. Can you talk some more about that?
I could talk a long time about that. Sure. It was a combination of personalities that weren't jibing well and of attitudes toward instruction, especially of composition. The divisions were basically Ray Eberhardt, Irma Davis, and Blossom Wall, who was the other person who'd been hired, on one hand, and Walt Garrett and Ted Fuse. Walt was a new hire a couple of years before me. He came from Indiana. Otherwise, everybody else had been, with the exception of Blossom, she came in the same year I did, everybody else had been together in the public schools in Elgin. So it revolved around a difference of opinion about whether everybody should teach writing in the same way, which would be sort of a high school curriculum approach, and whether you could have flexibility, and it was also a philosophic difference between the what became the whole English approach, writing that's based on real experience, versus classical rhetoric and modeling. The outlier, there were two outliers in the situation. I obviously was one, but I didn't get mixed in immediately. I was trying to get my feet on the ground here, get my family life settled, and was sharing an office with Ray Eberhardt. So that pretty well decided a few things, like which books I'd use. Like I'd said earlier, I'd never had anybody tell me what books to use before. And the other outlier was somebody spoken of with great reverence, a person named Dorothy Cummings. And Dorothy was away. Dorothy took a leave of absence. She had tragically lost her husband and then eventually a handicapped son that she'd cared for many years. Both sides in this conflict really loved Dorothy, and I think it may partly have blown up or blown out of proportion because she was away. She had taken that year's leave of absence to go to the writer's workshop at the University of Iowa. And when she came back, besides somewhat smoothing things over or helping smooth things over, she and Irma Davis started on what became the Writers' Center to encourage not only student creative writing, but also creative writing throughout the community. So those were the differences. I don't think they ultimately really got resolved until Walt Garrett split off to start the humanities department.
And that conflict at that point then, when Walt Garrett moved into the humanities department, did it get resolved? And
more or less. Ted Fuse continued to do the things he was doing, but the first few years in the schedule, it listed whether people were doing traditional writing classes or the other writing classes. They were referred to in the name of a guy named McCrory who developed the method. And it was tough. I think the English department lost a lot of traction within the college as a whole because it was viewed as difficult, maybe a little radical, or at least some of those people were, and the college kind of chose up sides. Counselors were steering students one way or another on the basis of
to the tradition,
yeah,
the
right,
Ferrari
right.
method.
So it was an interesting environment, and besides trying to adapt, I really could live with either method and created a hybrid of my own that worked really well for me, and got involved in a lot of committee work. I did a lot of things outside the department for a while.
So your experience at Northern, where you were involved in committee work, also you took that experience and did the same thing at Elgin.
Right. I really, from early on, wanted to be doing new things. I wanted to be involved across campuses. So it was a natural for me and an outlet to some degree. But one of the worst things that happened as a result of the split was that we, as an English department, really did not get faculty support in a negotiations period with the Board of Trustees. And from the perspective of the English department, pretty much got thrown out of the boat and into the water because math was able to retain a lighter course load and English teachers got 5 classes. And considering the fact that composition was a major part of our load, that was a real burden. It was a significant loss and made things very, very tough. So a lot of what we did in curriculum development for the next few years had to do with trying to get a grip on how you teach 4 comp courses and also try to stay sane. I did make sure of one thing. That was the last time I wasn't on a negotiating committee until I went into administration, because that was bad. And I stayed very heavily involved in the curriculum committee.
Can we talk a little bit about the longitude of your teaching career and the courses that you taught?
Well, in the beginning, obviously, the load was composition and literature courses. And there weren't a lot of literature courses to go around. At the same time, the humanities courses were drawing off students who used to enroll in the literature courses. So it was a real danger for people to be teaching 5 comp courses. And a lot of what I worked at early on was trying to generate new courses that could meet the humanities requirement. And we got pretty creative for a while. I was also trying to build bonds with other departments. So we tried team teaching with some outside inputs, like some of the humanities courses teamed up with comp courses, worked on developing a whole series of topics courses and community services courses, non-credit courses that could be literature but could be counted for load. The topics courses particularly evolved toward things like pop culture. Pop culture was a very big thing in the 60s and in the 70s. And that ran on pretty well for quite a while. It did help keep us sane. Student enrollments eventually grew, so there was an opportunity for more literature courses. I think our relationships with other departments and counseling became healthier. We fought a big battle which really doesn't relate to course development itself, but we fought a big battle to get and then to retain first more developmental courses in the sequence, because we were having less well-prepared students coming to the college, and to get placement through reading placement exams, again, a holistic assessment. And that helped because it made it possible for a teacher not to have a totally homogeneous group in a composition class, but to have some both investment and some guarantee that the students were in an appropriate cohort for the curriculum they were getting. That was a long battle to get it, and it was a long battle to retain over a period of time.
So can you talk a little bit about the developmental courses? What was the English sequence like when you came in 71?
There was only one course.
There was one developmental course.
Right. And seeing this influx of students who were less well prepared, lots more students coming to community colleges, we felt we had to create other levels, eventually 3 in developmental courses, and also to control placement and enrollment in English 101 and English 102 at the other 2 levels of the sequence. So we were able eventually to pretty much guarantee that a teacher would get at least one literature course, sometimes more than one, maybe a creative writing course if that was their particular interest, and strongly encourage people to work through all levels of the sequence, to teach developmental, the first course in college composition and the second course in college competition, so that loads were always mixed. In the beginning, it was a lot more standardized. Most sections of the first college level course were in the fall. Most sections of the second level course were in the spring. But all those distinctions eventually broke down too. So you ended up with a very mixed load. But among the things I'm proudest of having been able to influence, along with my colleagues who saw it as a real valuable experience, was to make sure that, in the beginning anyway, everybody stayed with teaching all the courses in the sequence and everybody participated in placement. And teaching all the courses in the sequence was important for the placement process because people knew what expectations should be for ability in each of those students coming in.
So you said that there was a battle about placement and a battle about developmental courses. Was that battle fought at the curriculum committee level? Was that battle...
Both administration and curriculum committee.
But
You had to win. You really had to win over the curriculum committee first, and also administration, because it drained resources. I mean, the big argument was between, and I did a lot of work, actually, I'd forgotten about, trying to document the fact that the investment in placement paid off in retention. So, and it did. I mean, there really wasn't any doubt. But the college went through cycles of development, stability, shrinkage, and then development again. And during those times, and particularly in the down times, you're always vulnerable to cutting resources, increasing class size, all the things you hear about in the public schools every day. So that was the argument, essentially, which is more productive, to meet students where they are and deliver what they need, or just to try to push everybody through a standardized curriculum that's easier to manage.
Right.
Well, we eventually won, and I think we didn't win, the students won. And it was the pressure of student need that accomplished it. We went through a period where, again, we had some retirements out of that early cohort. That created some flexibility, brought in some new talent, brought in new ideas, and people better prepared to teach. I mean, when I went through graduate school, nobody was teaching you how to teach, especially writing. They were sending you into a classroom cold. So overall, it was a great adventure. I mean, you did what you had to do, and we were reaching out. We were reaching out into the community. I think I taught in remote locations everywhere in the district except St. Charles, and I'm not sure they let us in. I'm really not positive about that. But we were very heavily involved in District 300. We were involved in U46 schools across the board. We taught in those locations during the day and at night. And though I never taught in it, we had a very strong program going with John Neer, Walt Garrett, a number of other people teaching out in District 300 classrooms for college credit. So all of this was feeding into the social change that was around us. We had the influx of veterans, and we had the influx of immigrants that came first from Southeast Asia. Certainly the Hispanics eventually wanted to come to college more than they had in the past and were here longer periods of the year. So all those pressures made it possible. And the college, by and large, sometimes by fits and starts, met the challenges over and over.
You had talked about when you first came to ECC, your department was using either the traditional method or the McCrory method.
Mm-hmm.
And at some point, it dispersed even further than that, where faculty members could teach sort of in their own way, or
Yes.
or what? Okay.
Yeah,
And did
definitely.
that fracture the department, or did it?
No, it enriched it.
Talk to me some more about that.
Well, as I said, we went through some transitions. A lot of the earlier faculty retired. We were bringing in new faculty with new talents at the same time. We were fostering a culture of development across the college, of work to try to update what we were doing in our own classrooms, but in other areas of the college. I know a couple of years I got involved with projects Dennis Sienko was doing, where he was trying to work with the vocational faculty and community vocational needs, and we even spent, drawing on my prison experience, one whole summer going to the correctional institutions, the juvenile correctional institutions in the area, and trying to figure out basically how ECC programming could be delivered here or elsewhere, one way or another. You know, I think somewhere and about your next topic, you're going to talk about the relationships between vocational faculty and liberal arts faculty. And during those growing years, the first years I was here, I really didn't see any separation at all. I don't know what people will tell you, but I think we were all excited to be together. The vocational teachers were here, the liberal arts teachers were here. It was show and tell all the time. Jim Kimmey wanted everybody down on the lower floor where he was located to use his transit to see the John Hancock building, and then later the Sears Tower. People were sharing, and it was a much smaller place.
And so the English department was next to what department when you first moved in?
The whole college was in one, pretty much, in one small building. I mean, vocational areas were tucked in downstairs or back on the back parts of this, what used to be the original building. Upstairs, the third floor of the central building was the English department, the speech department next to us. We had the social sciences area. We had the art department up there. Music wasn't, but everybody else was, pretty much. So all the liberal arts were concentrated there. Sciences were on a different level and in a smaller space than they've ever been since. So I think there was a lot of synergy, really. And that it's a little paternalistic, but we had, under the first two presidents, I only was with Gil Renner 1 year, I think, and he retired. Then Bob Apple. There was a lot of collegiality among the families of the vocational as well as the liberal arts folks. There were
So
bridge
families
groups.
would get together?
Yeah, particularly bridge couples, but there were family events for sure. And I think in later years, when we went through growth periods, there were attempts later to try to recapture some of that. You had to do it in a different way, but it certainly is true that among our oldest friends in Elgin are people who had been in the math department, Don Green and his wife Dorothy in the technology area, and the Kimmies, plus Garrett's, Weiss's. It was a lot of fun.
Can we move on to your role with instructional technology?
Okay.
I understand that you were one of the first adopters of telecourses. Can you tell us
That's
something
true.
about that?
We were very fortunate at a period to get some grant money, get some support. We had a lot of interest in not only going out into the community with classroom teaching, but distance learning, as it ultimately became called, and an emphasis on telecourses. Jack was leading that effort. We obviously tried to identify courses that would be appropriate and to use materials that were available mostly through public broadcasting in the beginning. So Walt Garrett worked on Ascent of Man. I worked on a fiction series that PBS had provided programming for and some shell background for how to use it instructionally, but we turned that into a telecourse. And we got to a fairly wide range of offerings, and it was an increasing venture for quite some time. And a lot of fun. It really put me in more contact with people out in the community, non-traditional learners who were looking for some flexibility in their work schedule and trying to work on a college degree. And at the same time, a lot of the universities were starting to develop upper-level courses and graduate offerings that came out into the communities, developed centers in our area and other suburbs.
So it sounds like one of the thrusts was to really meet the students where they were.
Sure.
And to meet their particular needs. And that instructional technology allowed you to do that.
Mm-hmm. Gave an extra point of access. And the hope was that those folks would be able to combine that with some work on campus to increase degree completion or transfer. So it indeed did work, and it became a continuing effort as technology changed.
And as technology changed, then the college took on an adventure of online courses.
Correct. We did, indeed.
And I'd like to show you this photograph of a number of faculty members who were the first to actually implement online courses at Elgin. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, I certainly can. Put together a group to work. Jack provided the coordination and the resources, mainly technically John Putz and Barb Dorman, who had come on in academic computing. It is academic commuting, too, by the way. And it was a diverse group. We've got some English teachers, Karen Gordon and me. We've got a couple of math teachers, Lorraine Davey and Nick Mavros were early involved, a couple of data processing teachers, and I think maybe Linda Heffron was there. And that was kind of symptomatic about how technology got into instruction in the college as it expanded. Because even before that, we had been developing among the people who came in at a particular time of hiring when I was coordinating. It was a really exciting time. We brought in a number of people with diverse specialties that could help us. Cecilia Carrion and Karen came in developmental work. Larry Taylor came ultimately, well, Sarah Dye, and ultimately Bill Demery, all who have been involved in these kinds of efforts. Larry, besides taking over the Writing Center as Irma Davis retired and as Blossom Wool stepped back from it, Larry really was a spark plug. He came from Southern Illinois University. He was a volatile personality, for sure, and very enthusiastic about his passions. And one of his passions was the need to use computers in the classroom. And the folks who knew the most about that on campus were the secretarial services staff, office administration. Technology is the more appropriate term these days, because secretaries pretty much went by the board. It was a revolution. So we were using computers in our classroom. We could draw on their expertise and John's, Barb's, and I know the library was automating at the same time. We got into a lot of challenges that were fun and had us working across disciplines, just as we had to develop the telecourses. So there was a real foundation to get into distance learning. It was just the natural next step.
So the English department has really embraced, or has in the past really embraced technology at each level.
Absolutely. And
Each time period.
naturally, it was easiest to adapt what we thought would be the transfer level composition courses, but very early on it became obvious that developmental students could benefit just as much. And it was a little bit of an adjustment, but as soon as we could get the computers, the developmental courses were being taught on them. And only later was there effective enough instructional software to go beyond just using it for word processing. But Cecilia and Karen Gordon led us certainly to develop first exploration of a number of packages, selection, and ultimately working with the developers some to try to improve the products. Because I think we were a beta test site for some software developers for a while. So it was a lot of fun, great learning experience. I think overall with the faculty here, that earlier bit of collegiality and sharing by people who are really enthusiastic about their particular area, their passion, but willing to teach it to each other, either by inviting people into their classrooms, by teaching classes with somebody in a totally unrelated area, sometimes a vocational area in a composition class, to develop interdisciplinary courses, many of which had to be standardized when we got to the Articulation and Community College Compact, but it served us well. And then some of the grant programs that pulled people together in faculty development and staff development across all areas of the college were really beneficial, and I think gave something special as the arts developed at ECC. Same thing. I mean, as soon as the college could support it to develop more of a community arts emphasis with not only the Elgin Symphony, but the Choral Union and with drama. So I think there would be periods when we'd sort of isolate, but then come together, and particularly the creative folks would cross-fertilize. And we were able to hire very well. Overall, I think we've been really lucky in the culture we created, but also in the human resources we found.
Definitely. Let's take a little break.
Okay.
This is a continuation of an interview with Thomas Youngren, Professor Emeritus of English with Elgin Community College. This interview is being conducted on February 12th, 2016 at Elgin Community College. The interviewer is Polly Nash, and the interview is being recorded by Jack Weiss. What I'd like to move to now is your movement from the classroom into some leadership responsibilities and activities that you were involved in the Office of Instruction and Educational Services. Can you talk to us some about that?
Sure. I'm happy to. I got involved in some college-wide projects over the time period we've talked about before. Some of them were technology-oriented, some were curriculum-oriented, some were more in the area of certainly getting involved in developing some of the grants or helping provide some of the background to develop grants, particularly working with Lynn Willett. I talked about Dennis Sanko a little bit before. Lynn Willett was driving as a kind of community-oriented person. He had kind of a hybrid job in the president's office under Mark Hopkins.
So this was before he became vice president?
Yes.
Okay.
Yep. And he moved into that vice president's role after the success of the grants programs. I'm not totally aware of what all was involved in those transitions, but it was also a time, even though it was a very creative time, it was a time of some upset within the college, and then things settling down a little bit and really starting to reap the fruits of a lot of hard work in developing those grants and then trying to really grow the talent base and the flexibility, the responsiveness of the faculty.
Focused on?
Well, one component of what ultimately became my job, obviously faculty development, and also trying to develop I guess the foundation for the college to even strengthen more than it had before, its responsiveness to the community, to try partly to get community support, but I think in a very sincere effort to meet the needs that were around us. It is true that Elgin went through some very tough times. That as the core of the district had to go through quite a bit of development, and it really was community leadership that gradually began to build the infrastructure for a much larger corporate tax base in the community. Long-term, very serious long-term development in things that voters sometimes had a hard time seeing the value of, like sewers and water. I mean, literally the sewer and water system and laying the foundation for roads and developments for those resources helped fuel what eventually became, along with a little bit of gambling money, a pretty strong foundation for economic growth in the immediate area. Growth up and down the Fox Valley got benefited in spite of some backtracking and recessions in the early 80s, to being on what could become, and I think the college did a pretty good job of anticipating and responding to the cutting edge of incredible development around here. And the human resource faculty development piece was critical because, for one thing, we were having to rely more and more on part-time faculty to deliver key courses, like the composition courses and math courses. And a lot was done for development and developing new technologies, new approaches in all the standard departments, but also in terms of how to nurture a part-time staff that kept the quality high for us. And a component of that was developing faculty supervision, using full-time faculty partly to coordinate with other school districts, high school districts, but also with our part-time faculty, who were sometimes high school teachers, but often people from the community with expertise or degrees who'd like to teach, but they couldn't find a job doing it, or they just wanted to keep their hand in, because teaching is very nurturing. It's very creative if it's approached correctly. So by developing that device of faculty supervision, which included an evaluation component along with the development piece, which was delivered both by the college centrally under Ed Herring and a team he developed, and standardizing approaches, appropriate approaches in a few tracks for the major instructional areas of the college that included a basic methodology in delivering instruction that both could impact the full-time faculty we had, essentially the vocational faculty using the same methodology as the liberal arts faculty, and that whole cadre of part-time people. So that was a tremendous benefit, and pretty successfully carried out. In fact, it gained lots of national recognition. The key members of that team were people like John Neer, Jane Lehman, Diane Kogan, who was here and ultimately went to the California university system. Under the direction, as I said, of Ed Herring, a couple of folks from the vocational areas. I know Linda Heffron was pretty heavily involved. And that was an ongoing activity. I think a major crisis, though, once the grant money was going to end, was how and to what degree was the college, the board, and the administration willing and able to continue what had been done in that burst of creativity. So that pretty much put us on the cusp, and the two big leaders in that effort, two guys I'd been working with earlier in the visioning process to not only carry out the grant development, but also to support, that was the strategic planning piece for a North Central accreditation evaluation. Ed Herring and Lynn Willett and I worked on a college-wide collaborative exercise trying to involve every area of the college, including staff, certainly administration and all the instructional areas, to set goals, and those goals ultimately became part of not only acquiring the grants, but also a key piece of the North Central presentation. On the heels of that, Lynn and Ed both moved on. So when that occurred, and there was a period of change in the college and the leadership, Paul Heath was coming on as president, and he was a president for quite a number of years. After that, we were coming off the kind of incubation period we'd had under Sir Earl Charles after Mark Hopkins, which was, again, I think I mentioned this to you too off camera, as you're well aware. We alternated between those father figures, like the first two presidents I was familiar with, and some hard drivers, Mark Hopkins being one of the first, and certainly Paul, who I worked with most closely, because I ended up in kind of a hybrid position, if you will, in instruction. The driver for that selection was, I think, and it was an open process. So even though I'd been encouraged to apply for administrative posts before, once at the time when you came onto the college, Polly, in the midst of the Hopkins era, I declined because we had a lot of family pressures, in the sense that my wife had an even more demanding career than I did. Linda was had worked her way up into serious responsibility in information technology and was commuting. And for a number of those years, I was catching the kids at home around my flexible teaching schedule. But this opportunity coincided with the time when our son, who was the younger of our two children, Dan, entered high school. And his older sister, Leslie, was able to drive. So I could alter my schedule just a little bit. Took a shot at it. Didn't really know for sure what I was getting into. I consulted, as I always did, people like you, who were my really trusted friends and colleagues, and took a gamble. Was a new vice president of instruction because Lynn had left and Charles Rory came on. He was probably a more known quantity for you folks than he was for me because you already worked for him as deans. And I started out as an assistant to him, assistant vice president. That, within a couple of years, got converted to a dean title. Whether it was a good thing for that to happen or not, still up for debate, but it did occur. But since the position really had been put together to solidify some things that had already been in place, professional development, evaluation, and research, which is a hybrid if you ever heard one. The professional development piece was visible, highly visible actually, because lots of staff and especially faculty expectations built around that and about it continuing. A lot of independence had been created by some mini grants to foster creativity or to increase sabbaticals so people could do more graduate coursework and upgrade their skills academically if they needed to. Moving on to the idea that it needed to be an ongoing effort, but there were major questions of credibility with the board and with the administration. Somehow, for the first 2 years, my main focus in terms of faculty development, other than trying to keep some things going that were already in place, was to try to organize, standardize, and try to gain credibility for those programs so the college would keep at least its investment and increase it long term. There was outside pressure to help encourage that because the NCA accreditation visit, the NCA accreditation visit from North Central, and the self-study we'd conducted before that, certainly came down strongly in terms of the staff development program for both faculty and staff and administration. But came down very hard on how we were showing value. I think the outside accrediting agencies, because the Illinois Community College Board had cited us for not providing accurate information on enrollments, on class sizes. I'll try to put it kindly, developing administrative data processing capabilities that were commensurate with the complexity we'd created in the programs and in the activity, and our ability to produce information, accurate information, was somewhat lacking. So we'd been cited by the ICCB, and that was a factor in North Central asking for a return visit, a focus visit. So the goals I had for the first 2 years were handed to me. That was not a collaborative process. It was either 15 or 16 items. They were in each of these areas, and they were the areas of concern that were going to be hit. The marks we had to hit in order to meet the expectations when North Central returned, and to avoid further sanctions from the Illinois Community College Board. So the visible part was to try to create more credibility and consistency and maintain the sense of staff collaboration with creating a little more credibility and what would convince the board was a little more control of the fiscal impacts of what was occurring. Because naturally people were moving across the salary schedule at the same time. All of these mini grants were bearing fruit. So it's an expensive program, but a truly worthwhile investment. The piece most people didn't see or didn't fully understand, because I sure as heck didn't see it, was the situation we're in terms of our registration system, our scheduling, and our ability to provide meaningful data about what was going on in the classrooms. So that was the institutional research and evaluation piece. And I had to get to work on those. And I'm not a numbers guy. I'm a word guy. So I did the best I could to manage understanding the numbers, to ask questions, and to get help. The key people, really the only people I had to rely on in keeping the development program going and in trying to get a handle on the information systems, were Susan Spengler-Abel, who was the assistant secretary, basically, in that office, and a rock you could rely on, well, sometimes a volcanic rock, and Sandra Anthony, who had pretty much been kept in the dark and simply given orders by conflicting parts of the college, and Sue Smithson, who at the time had not reverted to her maiden name, was Sue Struckman, who was the assistant to the president and who could understand and did the schedule at that time in a very laborious process. we got a lot of resistance, a lot of feeling that this wasn't important from the business side of the college. Mike Shirley was good on the big picture, but he liked to let his managers run their own shops, and he was much more, as vice president for finance, interested in the money side and in the systems that handled collecting tuition, expenditures, purchasing, buildings, because building was a huge activity at several times in his career. And Ted Spella, who was his director of information. And the only way I could figure out, and we could figure out, Dr. Rory and I, of how to begin to get a handle on this was to develop a users committee. All the offices that were really involved in data, and have Ted Spella and I co-chair, because we were really the two people who had the responsibility. I was essentially, for everything but the business programs, the lead user. And Ted obviously had not really embraced the changes in information systems. Over the years he was here. He was an old mainframe systems guy, but we had a lot of smart people. I had a resource at home. My wife Linda, as I said earlier, had been involved in IT. We talked that a lot, and I certainly understood the system she worked with and what was attainable. And we spent a lot of time, 3 people. I mentioned the folks who assisted me. My major allies in this were Judy Job, who was the director of admissions, or dean of admissions, and ultimately admissions and student services. Sue, who had to suffer through trying to create the schedule along with the deans and try to keep a lot of people happy, a lot of stuff that didn't fit together that had been traditional, that really didn't fit a data structure you could use, and Barb Dorman in academic computing. So we got that committee going, and I did cultivate a relationship with Ted Spella and tried to make him more comfortable with the changes we need to go through. We brought in a lot of resources that he would trust, which mostly were marketing people from IBM, and I think in Mike's mind there may have been a point where he flirted with the idea of outsourcing as opposed to trying to develop our systems. Well, it would have been great for human resources, and everything he operated would have been a disaster for us.
Because we had a homegrown system. You're talking about all of that.
We had an antiquated, this is going to get way too technical too fast, but we had a bunch of antiquated flat file systems that were not in a relational database of 4GL, fourth generation language, and which really needed to be junked. So we kept working and did get the consultants in, and naturally the consultants reinforced these needs. And I think Ted honestly began wanting to help, but he needed assistance, and we sort of found it for him. He knew my wife because we'd gone to a couple of conferences with these vendors, a couple of IBM conferences together. And when when Linda was with Unisys Corporation in Elk Grove Village, she worked with a person named Brenda Preuss. Brenda worked for Linda. So the committee reached the point where they said, you've got to build a department. You've got to build a capability in systems analysis to in-house, as certainly the vendors were saying, to make this transition work. Because we had to take all that old stuff and fit it into a relational database. So Ted hired Brenda. She came on. And that helped. I mean, we really had the ability. I could never be a technical data person. I did learn just out of self-preservation because Sandra Anthony, who was the tech assistant, was often sick. I did learn how to do that job. Somehow I fit it in. But when she would be gone, and combined it usually with borrowing an employee, usually from Judy Job, because Judy had people who had some technical training, and she had a very strong vested interest in getting the schedule out and making sure we could bring in students. So the key project really became redoing the registration system. It's probably more than you want to know, but we did evolve, and Ted eventually did retire. It was an interesting period because it was a real struggle. But I found, besides the support from the people internally I've talked about, certainly all the deans, Judy in particular was involved on the nitty-gritty, being able to get some outside help in from a business environment that was current in Brenda. And we began to get things under control. The focus visit actually went pretty well. We met all the goals. On the outside, I got a lot of help from Virginia McMillan at the Illinois Community College Board. She was the person there who was very helpful, and she put me in touch with people who had the best systems of the kind we needed in the community college system. So that was a tremendous help, and I'll always be grateful for that. I'll be grateful, I keep paying for it, for Linda's assistance and expertise. Really, the college got a lot of good out of its investment in making it possible for her to go through some business courses and put our young son in the new daycare center Liz Wilmus was running, so that she could take some business courses and get ready, she thought, to go get an MBA. So she is actually an Elgin Community College graduate. She did not want to go back to teaching. She wanted to be where the action was. And the action was in information systems. And she could write, and she could speak. She was a speech major. And did very well in her career. But that's a debt the college got paid back in unpaid consulting over at least 2 or 3 critical years.
So you were involved really in 2 accreditation visits.
Mm-hmm. Well, a focus visit.
The focus visit, right.
And I'd been on visitation teams earlier in other institutions, but I'm at other institutions. So it really started, the intense involvement was tied around that focus visit, getting that accomplished. And then we did ultimately begin building a capability in institutional research. But you couldn't really make much benefit out of an institutional research position until you had the data systems that could be mined by somebody who had the ability. So our first director was Steve Cordigan, and he came in a little later in the process. We had to really try and do it ourselves to get by those first 2 or 3 years. But we did, and things solidified so I could begin breathing a little easier when we got out of schedule, when we did the academic calendar, when we did all kinds of things that are much easier in a modern environment.
You talked about faculty development. You were also involved in support staff development.
Right. Part of keeping the faculty development program ongoing undoubtedly had to do with establishing collective bargaining in the college. And our faculty, to their credit, put more priority on keeping some of those development activities going than it did on simple salary increases. So they had a lot of goals. Some created a lot of headaches for me. Some I could certainly support wholeheartedly, since I was a charter signer of the agreement to join IFT before I became an administrator. But naturally, the support staff developed or negotiated the contract shortly after the faculty did. Not immediately, but shortly after. And Susan Spengler A. Bell was instrumental in them doing that, along with a lot of other colleagues, including Jack's assistant, Carolyn Roller, and a bunch of other people. And the priority for them was salary, certainly, but it was also staff development. And that was really fun, because they did succeed in getting that included in their contract. It was a lesser version of what the faculty was doing, and it included participation on an institutional basis with a lot of the same opportunities the faculty were involved in. And I certainly hope that those folks taking advantage of those opportunities led to them being able to be much more productive in the jobs they were in, and also to be promotable. I think of any number of people who, because they could work their regular job and could also go to school or gain special workshops, could move into higher level positions in the support staff. It was a wonderful time for me because I not only now worked with every administrator in the school, every faculty member in the school, it was every support staff member in the school. And I doubt I ever mastered it completely. But I felt like I knew about 99.9% of the people who worked here. It's really a great community within the walls, and certainly reaching out.
So during your tenure with the college, you were a faculty member,
Mm-hmm.
you were an administrator, you were a leader in our North Central efforts, one with the focus visit that was really scary to you, and then leading the, I think it was the second one.
It was the next one, and it's the one where we managed, even though we're in the middle of campus turmoil again, leadership turmoil, we did manage to gain 10 years, which was the maximum that North Central allowed. And we never looked back at problems with the community college board. But that's true. We did go through another North Central evaluation process. Dr. Rory, it was probably a year and a half before he left when he persuaded the president and also, obviously, whoever else he had to persuade, probably the board, that I could handle running the North Central process. I tried to approach it the way I had everything else, which was basically to go ask everybody I knew to help and listen and work on committees and collaborative structure that would do most of the work. And it was a fine plan, except things changed. I got drafted. I have to honestly say I competed for it, but as Dr. Rory left, I was among several people who applied internally to take over the job as vice president on an interim basis. And we thought that process would take about 6 months. Unfortunately, it stretched into a year and a half. And during that period of time, of course, Dr. Heath left. We went through a search process. The vice presidential search went all the way through the final interviews, and there was no decision. So it went on the back burner for a presidential search. Well, I did get lots of help. We had the foundation for a participatory process pretty well in place, and we had the institutional research wing pretty well under control, because not only did we have Steve Cordigan, we'd added Penny Armstrong to help him out. These are all the nuts and bolts you have to have in place that most people don't know. We'd visited and studied best practices, been to lots of workshops, sent people, both from all areas of the college, to several North Central workshops. So we were ready to go, but I ended up, for first a brief period of time that never was intended to extend through the North Central period, filling in for the vice president, and at the same time continuing to do as much of the other job as I could. The resources were provided. We got help in writing, in particular Carolyn Bullinger, and later she got some help from Karen Gordon, who were able to keep the paper mill going, and the committees were really very, very effective. So, and I think the instructional staff in particular pulled together, the deans. They used to refer to the Archbishop of Canterbury as first among equals. So with you folks and the rest of what Dr. Rory had called the VP team, sometimes we were a team, sometimes not so much. But that's natural in these situations. As we move through trying to get things done and not just maintaining things, but keeping them moving, it worked out very well. I'm deeply in debt to those folks. I don't want to leave anybody out, but besides Jack and Polly, especially through the long haul, we had Judy Job, Barry Carroll, Eric Larson. Did I say Judy already? Okay. Don Kinsey in the vocational area. Math and science. Kinsey, I guess. So if I left anybody out, I apologize. I still love you dearly, but I see these other people more often. I even used to see Don Kinsey driving around in trucks. He was an interesting guy. He was we all make our deals with the devil, and the one he had made was he would become certified in any area that he supervised. So, aviation program, he learned to fly. Truck driving program, he became qualified as a trucker and to teach trucking. Well, I'm going to have trouble because there are stories all over like that. The people here are really, really passionate about what they do. Don's deal with the devil was to learn to do everything. Mine was to never do the same thing twice. Especially the first years I was teaching, before we got to standardization and lesson plans, I always threw my notes away at the end of the term and reread everything I was going to teach because I wanted to be fresh, and I was always looking for new ways to do it. It's an incredible environment. I assume it still is. And people really do ultimately care about what they do for students, and about each other. Sometimes we fight.
That's what we do.
Mm-hmm. Because you're passionate about what you think is needed. But as long as people were willing to work together and reach some kind of agreement for the bigger issues, I think by and large, it's turned out incredibly.
When you think about your leadership positions and your various responsibilities, if you could talk about the most favorite thing that you remember.
Absolutely. Hiring. It's how the change developed. From the time the English department started to change, I don't know how many hiring committees I was on, because I served on them for a lot of other departments as well, and certainly was deeply involved in everybody we hired in the English department during the time I was a full-time part of it. And I stayed with it even when I wasn't, but I couldn't influence decisions directly. Sometimes I got to see the results of the process, particularly in the period when I was acting vice president. And it was always exciting, really always exciting, to see new people, to see what they had to offer that we didn't already have, and to try to judge whether they could fit in and thrive in the culture. Mostly they did.
What about the least favorite thing that you remember?
Well, the hardest thing for me, because I don't like numbers and I don't like detail and I like to do new things, was to try to standardize all that stuff in that dean's office, especially struggling with numbers. And I got to be honest, trying to keep track of budgets when I was vice president, because I knew how creative all these people were. And I knew I had to try to defend what you guys wanted to spend money on. I hope it worked. So that was difficult. That was a struggle. But I was happy to do it because that was a large part, not the only part, of the challenge. The other thing I really didn't like was hiring.
So it was your most favorite thing and your least?
Yeah, because if you really care, when it doesn't go right, you feel a lot of pain. And I think the most painful situation for me, and maybe for the college as a whole, was the hiring process we went through when Roy Flores came. It was one of those things where I think he got what he wanted, we got what we wanted, we thought, because it was far and away the most collaborative, open hiring process we'd ever had for a president at the college. The board bent over backwards to listen. I mean, I think that was part of all the fruits of all that development of collective bargaining, leading to a stronger collaborative rather than control posture between the board and the staff. And boy, we thought we could make a great decision. Well, sometimes the parties involved must be seeing things from a different perspective. And it crashed for a while. It was difficult. I said we had pushers, and particularly in terms of pushers with this staff, Mark and Roy Flores definitely.
That's Mark Hopkins.
Mark Hopkins and Roy Flores had mandates and knew their vision, but I'm not sure they fully understood what they had here in terms of the human resources and the creativity. And it's very tough to put that genie back in the bottle. So, I mean, personally, that was a difficult situation. To see it fail so spectacularly. And like some marriages, who knows? I've had failures in search processes other places. I've worked most notably in churches that sometimes don't work out so well. It's just in the nature of the beast.
Thank you. Are there any faculty, staff, or administrators who particularly stand out in your mind?
We don't have enough time. And again, I won't do justice. I already talked about two of the strongest presidents we've had. Paul Heath was certainly strong, but not as totally abrasive. And a lot of the labor situations were already on their way to being under control by the time he came in. All he had to do was learn how to live with the deals the board had made in bargaining. I think what always comes to mind for me are some of the louder voices, other than presidents. I mean, they're always the loudest voice, even when they're very quiet, like Sir Earl Charles. One of the loudest voices was Irma Davis, who not only was an English department member, very long-standing, certainly before I got here, one of the people who hired me, ended up just by happenstance being a neighbor living around the corner. And I remember the first time she heard Mike Shirley in a meeting at the start of the first semester that Mark Hopkins had his team together, and Mike was there. And it was the first of several shouting matches between Irma and Mike Shirley in public situations. Nobody was surprised when, after she retired and she went off to teach ESL, English as a second language, in China several times, and in Russia at the time when the Berlin Wall was falling, that she ended up in Red Square yelling at tanks, or at least the drivers of tanks. And that's a priceless picture. That's a priceless picture. Gail Shadwell had a pretty loud voice. She had the temerity to sue the president and the board. That might have been one reason why I didn't want to apply when you came on board, because I'm sure that had to be difficult, at least in the beginning, with absorbing Travis and Hauser and Gail back to faculty. And that, well, yeah, I'll mention that became a problem for me because the faculty was so upset about that whole situation, that whole transition, and split really on two sides in defending the people who were demoted, if you will, and thinking they should have left instead of been left to fester in the place. That was that when I reached the point where I knew I wanted to go back to faculty, I was disappointed that I had to fight my way back, because the faculty in its wisdom had bargained collectively to ensure that administrators would not be made faculty members. That was tough, and Roy Flores in particular, but also Edna Berry, who was his vice president, he brought in when I ceased to be the interim, made every effort to get me to leave. And I did not want to leave the college. The consultant that had assisted the board in hiring Roy was assigned to me to, I don't know if it was at the board's behest, it was certainly at Roy's, to try to get me to move elsewhere. And I didn't want to. I wanted to fulfill a promise that Charles Roy had made to me that I could go back to faculty if at some point it wasn't working out in administration. And I thought I was relatively successful as an administrator. So to go back, I first had to agree to stay through the North Central process and complete it, which I did, and to continue to do my original job, which I did and tried to do as well as I could. And then they would at least consider me going back to faculty, because I wasn't leaving. Besides loving this place, I really had personal reasons. I did not want to go to some place in southern Illinois or western Idaho and give up living in the Chicago metropolitan area, the Elgin Symphony, the Visual and Performing Arts Center here, and certainly didn't feel it was right for me to ask my wife to give up her career. So we wrote it out, and against faculty resistance, certainly, and I'm sure board resistance, I did succeed. And you were very helpful, Polly, in that transition, because you found a place and you found things for me to do, and I could immerse myself in teaching again. A few other things, but especially teaching. And in reality, it was a great blessing, because I had the challenge in a long growth period when I might have been at the point where I'd get stale in teaching. As much as I loved it, and I was able to continue it by keeping the telecourse through the whole time I was an administrator, to be able to go back to teaching and really rediscover that joy. It was a great way to end a career. And I really, if conditions had been different, probably wasn't ready to leave it. But again, the collective bargaining issues come up, and there were very strong pressures and incentives for many of us to retire.
And we had to make that declaration in advance.
You had to make it in advance and do some things to get to that point, which was fine. I mean, that was fun. But emotionally, it was a bad time. I was really depressed in the first months after I retired. Partly because my wife was still working, but also because there is a waiting period and you're not allowed to be on campus or to teach, if you wish, until that period is ended. But I got back as fast as I could.
And so you did continue teaching after you retired in 2000?
I did. Part-time for about 6 or 7 years. I'm not sure exactly which. I know I got to a 35th year pin here. And I really loved it. I continued to go to English department meetings. I continued to do placement because I thought that was very important. I enjoyed the collegiality with that staff and seeing people on campus, just being on campus. It was fun. Ultimately, I did decide, because we'd taken up a number of things that we liked to do, and my wife had become retired in the interim, I really reached the point where I didn't think it was fair to students to be away for any period longer than a day or two, and really wanted to be able to travel during academic terms, during the fall and winter, spring.
So that's what you've been doing in great part?
And yeah, I mean, obviously I started these things at the same time I was still teaching. I couldn't play basketball for years with the vocational and liberal arts guys who used to play basketball on Fridays at the college. That had actually started up here very early on in our tenure, just like it had there. But had taken up tennis a little bit while we were working here, and continued, got a lot more involved in retirement, gardening. I read a lot, stayed with study groups, and things like that. Just always trying to learn. I was able to change the focus of my reading. I didn't read literature as much. I read a lot more history and science. So got very active with the tennis club where we live at Sun City and Huntley. Like that environment very much, because we still have all our associations in the Fox Valley and a whole bunch of new people. we refer to it as it being like being at college again, because you're meeting all these new people, doing whatever you want in terms of interests, and doing quite a bit of travel over that period. The travel actually started with a core ECC group, along with the meddling or assistance of a great fan of ECC. But basically was a 4th of July party way back in the early 90s at Garrett's backyard, where a bunch of people from here and some other hangers-on, really along with a fellow Sterling Stu Ainsworth, who would work for Abbott Labs and has been a benefactor like Harry Blizzard of the college, and cultural groups, got kicking around the idea of foreign travel. Walt, back in his international studies lifetime, along with first Ted Fuse, cooperated with him on some trips with students to Europe, and then with with other folks. Sam Robinson was involved in that group. I don't know if he led any trips or not. Jack probably would. Dwayne Nelson with Walt teamed up on a couple of trips to Africa. And so Walt was the most traveled of the people there, with the exception of John Bradburn from math. John and his wife, Ruth, had traveled a lot because they had friends from college who, the guy was in the State Department, and as he was posted different places around the world, they went and visited and got the travel bug. So it evolved. It's been an ongoing and a changeable group, but we've had that as group support. We've done quite a bit of travel on our own.
And interspersed in that, you've also been active in our local SUA
That's true.
organization, Elgin Community College Pension Plan Participants.
Right. I picked up on that, started to get involved toward the end of when I was teaching on campus. Ray Eberhardt, the fellow who had been the original department chair in English, had been the longtime president of the SUA chapter, the State University Annuitants Association, a mouthful that we at least locally abandoned, which is essentially the pension advocate for all of the people in the state university retirement system. And ECC had a long history with that. You'll probably talk with Ray and you'll learn more about those things, so I won't dwell on that. But at the point when I got involved, like I say, I was about to phase out of teaching part-time, and I still wanted some bond with campus. The people who were on that board, that local board at the time, were all guys, all faculty guys, except, God bless her soul, Julie Henderson, who was a administrative assistant in a number of areas, ultimately in healthcare. And there really didn't seem to be much need for maintaining that organization. They were having a real hard time getting newer retirees, the people who came out in our cohort in the spring of 2003, and then several subsequent years, it looked like it was going to die out. And I got involved because I've had a long-time interest in politics, and Ray said, well, we do lobbying, particularly in Springfield and then with local legislators. And he basically convinced me just to give it a try, to go on that board, sit around. And the more I saw it, these guys didn't need to be meeting. And in fact, they met seldom. Ray had moved away. He still commuted to those meetings. But all the other guys saw each other every Wednesday at Golden K in Elgin anyway. And it looked like it was going to die out. And I was feeling a need for something that kept people's contact with the college. So we started out with that concept and trying to promote more diversity within the group. Julie had been talking to support staff development meetings for years about the need for the support staff in particular to be concerned about the safety of their pensions. She was in financial distress. She never really got to retire. She retired, her husband died, she lost half her Social Security, and that was her crusade. That the pension system, the way it was structured, really was not a sufficient deal for a lot of support staff, women in particular. So we started trying to promote and get more diversity, not just liberal arts and math guys, but some vocational faculty involved. Began to get support staff involved. Susan Spengler-Bell retired and succumbed to some arm twisting to get involved and to recruit among support staff. And of course, you both have ultimately become involved. We got it rolling. It's unfortunate that the main motivator for a lot of people was an increasing drumbeat of threats to the public pension system in general. And from our point of view, obviously the state university retirement system. But as those political pressures built and as more of those same good people got involved, it kind of snowballed. And especially it was gratifying when we made the breakthrough. It took a while, but we made the breakthrough to get current employees involved. By then, they were really interested. So it was great to have it come. I did a lot of work internally, but I did a lot of work at the state level, too. I was involved with the old political science interest. I was involved with the board of the Political Action Committee for many years, doing a lot of interviewing. And besides giving the retirees more of a connection back to the campus, which did indeed happen, I think. We managed to form links with a lot of the other suburban chapters in the organization to specifically promote the community college presence within the larger organization, because we were really second-class citizens. Still are, but keep trying. Now, there's less political action because the political situation in Illinois seems almost hopeless. But all of that moved into the legal arena. But I think it's been good for building bonds among retirees who weren't getting together in any organized way, and certainly among the current employees and the previous employees, because the retirees who have had at least from my perspective, a wonderful retirement, have invested a lot of time and energy in trying to preserve those same benefits for the people who are still working. So I'm grateful for that. I was really grateful when you folks and Jane Lehman in particular took over and kept growing it. I hope the residual social benefits continue. It was very helpful that Dr. Sam as president and the board really began to make retirees feel much more welcome on campus than they have before. Earlier practice had been to send records off to ICCB and shred them. The college never kept chose not specifically to keep track of its people who left. We've had some big donors. I think Carl Ayer would have donated no matter what, but but that's probably because of a strong bond to that earlier college that most of us saw metamorphose into something entirely different. There's one thing I'd like to throw in, if it's okay. One of the most gratifying things that I've experienced all the way through, really, in my career has been to have students in my classes who ultimately ended up either coming back to work at ECC or building really strong careers here. And among the first were Rick Green and Ken Ronsheimer, who didn't have degrees when they left the Wabansie automotive department to come to ECC. It was really fun to see these guys in their coveralls and their big boots sitting in the front row of my class. And I think Rick was more interested in what I was trying to give them than Ken was, but we remained friends for a long time. There were two interns. The one I worked with was Gary Christensen. Gary had been my student in English classes at ECC, had gone on to NIU, and then came back in one of those hybrid positions you administrative deans were so fond of creating when there wasn't enough budget to hire somebody full-time. So, Jack, I think you were in a hybrid position in the beginning between probably graphic arts and what ultimately became the library. Gary came in as half English department and half business department. Kind of schizophrenic, but he blended in and did his thing and has done it very productively. Joanne Dodell was a student of mine. Joyce Fountain, who really was one of the early folks that the college consciously took all the way from a staff position through higher education and ultimately to be at the college. I tried, but I could never get Susan Spengler-Bell or Sue Smithson to take advantage of the degree programs, but they didn't feel they need to, and truthfully they didn't in terms of the breadth of their perspective and their abilities and strengths. So I guess that's what's most important to me, to see the continuity and the growth and the diversity occurring.
So to wrap it up, you had 31 years of teaching and leadership in our college, and then you've been retired, teaching part of that time, but you've been retired 14 years. Is there anything else that you would like to reflect on as either high of your experience here
No, I'm sure I'll think of things over the next few days, but I'll probably evolve out of that. It is a privilege to have had this career, to know the people I've known, to have had the associations we've had, to grow together, and to know that, like my brothers, we all were able to complete our whole careers in one organization. Me with ultimately the college, but certainly in education the whole time. My younger brother Steve with the, in his case, with the Chicago Mercantile Exchange, he handled the money market research for the Merc for years and worked way too hard. And my brother Doug with the Treasury Department. They both commuted to Chicago, had the same careers, same employers that whole time. And I don't think that world exists much. So the college is a vehicle for people of any age to keep fulfilling their potential. That's something to be proud of and grateful to be associated with.
We thank you so very much for sharing with us your life and your career here at Elgin Community College.
Thank you.